Well, for the sake of cohesion, I am also not Melissa. No. My name is Patrick Tugwell, and I'm so excited to be back here with you today at HMC. As we begin, will you hear this prayer and song? And I'll praise you in this storm, and I will lift my hands, that you are who you are, no matter where I am, and every tear I've cried, you hold in your hand. You never left my side, and though my heart is torn, I'll praise you in this storm. God is with you in and through the storms. So if you are new to HUMC online or in person today, we're working through in this Lenten season the Exodus narratives. So today we have a pretty lengthy text. So thanks, Jonathan. Appreciate the easy text. That's great. And so there's some chaos ensuing here, right? So we find ourselves with Moses and Aaron's orders and Pharaoh's hardening heart, which I'm sure some people have heard before. Despite all this devastation in the biblical scene, my goal is for us to learn a little bit more about our responses through crisis moments today and who God is in and through crises. Because raise your hand if this is you, who in here has gone through extreme difficulties, challenges over the last few months? Raise your hand. Online too, I'm sure, raising some hands. So these swarms may look a little bit different from the ones in the biblical text, but as we'll see today, this passage is extremely relevant for us right now. In preparation for this message, I was actually struck by the two stories of leadership that we saw between Moses and Pharaoh. So we see a contrast of Moses and Aaron's faithfulness to God and Pharaoh's defiance. Faithfulness or defiance. So as we're reflecting on this text, let's try to put ourselves into the shoes of those dealing with these swarms. So chaos, insects, otherwise, all flying all around, people feeling like they're losing control. Nothing is going according to plan. I don't know if anyone in here has felt that before. How would they have felt watching their world turn upside down? Pastor Jonathan talked last week about certainty in the uncertainty, about finding ourselves like Moses in uncertain times when we're not sure if we can handle what's happening around us or feeling even unsure that we're capable of what we're called to do. So the key question for us today, then, is when the scene around us is in crisis, when things are uncertain, how do we respond in those spaces? Do we draw closer to God, or do we pull away? So for this Exodus 8 scene, I'm just going to briefly break it down into three sections because there's a little lengthy. I want to make sure that we go through it here. So in verses 1 through 15, we have the second of the swarms. So the first one was last chapter. We have the frogs here, right? So this is the frogs. So what's happening? So Moses was told to return to Pharaoh, command him to let God's people go. So he told if he refused God, it would be the plague of frogs would happen, right? So Pharaoh's heart was still hardened. So Aaron stretched out the staff over the waters. The frogs came up and covered the land. Okay. But then Pharaoh's magicians were able to convince Pharaoh that if they had similar powers with their secret arts and practices, so they could do the same thing, right? So then he agreed to let people go, and the frogs were gone. The next day, all the frogs died, and the Egyptians gathered them in piles, and the whole country smelled. So that was kind of the scene here, right? So that's the first third. And the Pharaoh hardened his heart and didn't keep the promises. Okay, so we're still back to the faithfulness and defiance. Then in verses 16 through 19, we have the third swarm, so the gnats, or insects. And God told Aaron to strike the ground dust with his staff. And when he did, the dust became the gnats, and they filled the land. So a similar thing happening here. Pharaoh's magicians tried to recreate the miracle, but they couldn't do it. And so then they told Pharaoh that this is the finger of God, implying that God clearly had more power and authority. And so, but then Pharaoh hardened his heart again, wouldn't listen to him, and so the gnats covered everything. So that's the second third. And then the last chunk, we have the fourth swarm, which is the flies. God speaks through Moses, commands Pharaoh to let God's people go, and otherwise a swarm of flies would be sent, okay? Then the next day, a massive swarm of flies covers the Egyptians, the houses, the animals, and all the ground. The flies ruined the land. Pharaoh told Moses that he would let the people go in the wilderness and sacrifice as long as God took away the flies. God removed all the flies, but Pharaoh again hardened his heart, didn't let the people go. So in this story, we see two very human responses. Moses and Aaron's faithfulness are pulling closer to God, honoring God's request to the best of their ability, and Pharaoh's disobedience, or pulling away from God, trying to go one's own way. So it's interesting, and I've heard this passage taught several times, and I've heard it taught where God is simply flexing power and authority over all the people, that God's irritated at Pharaoh and the worship of other gods, and therefore just sends swarms to punish the people for the sake of it. I can see how this interpretation comes about. So a lot of Old Testament texts show on the surface God seemingly being harsh, right, and punishing opposite of kind of the character of an all-loving God. So it can be a challenging text. In this form of interpretation, God is punishing people for their best interest. Often, those who teach this interpretation use a comparison of parents punishing their children harshly for their own best interest. And I think this is a fine interpretation, but I do think that there is some nuance missing from the character of God in these scenes. So I have two main points on this. The first point is, I believe God shares in our pain. I believe it pains God when we are not faithful to God. I don't believe that an all-loving, all-encompassing God punishes people for the sake of it, and I think this is important to note. I believe it's a little reductionistic to characterize God who we can't fully understand, and we sing about and we talk about and pray about that he's all-encompassing God. And yet, we kind of simplify it to a simple parenting tactic. I just don't think that that is who God is. I believe that whether we respond like Moses, Aaron, or Pharaoh, God desires for each of us to pull closer to God and not pull away by trying to do things alone. And this is God's true nature, a loving God even when we attempt to go our own way. Even when we are faithless, God is faithful. A second piece of nuance here is that there is an inherent element of suffering taking place in these scenes. I think we can attempt, again, to put ourselves in the shoes of those experiencing these swarms and imagine it would have been overwhelming and devastating. So that sometimes in these moments of crisis and chaos around us, when we feel like we're being faithful to God, we might be left wondering, why is this even happening to us? Like we're seeming like we're doing the right things, but there's still crisis happening, and we're not sure why. And at the same time, if we're trying to do our own thing, we might even try to ignore that it's happening or even play off the crisis as unimportant and just continue to pull away more and more. So let's take a step back and think about the big picture here. So all you know, again, putting yourself in their shoes, all you know has been uprooted and altered. Have you felt this before? All that you have been familiar with has been shaken, and you're not sure what to do next. So what do? Do you step forward? That requires taking a step in the dark without a lighted path at your feet. Do you step back? That requires rehashing all that has previously taken place. Or do you stand still? Do you stand put? And that means potentially pausing on your career, your goals, your intentions, all the while those around you seem to have it all figured out. Here's my second point for us today. God desires our faithfulness not just for the sake of it, not just to avoid pain or suffering or the chaos around us, but instead that we might experience the guidance of God's loving hand in and through these times of discomfort or uncertainty, and ultimately that others may see God through the way you experience those trials. So I want to take a second now, and I've used this illustration before. Think about an orange, okay? So when you squeeze the orange, what comes out? Is it apple juice? Okay, good. So probably not apple juice unless you have bad oranges, right? So that's what comes out is what's inside. What comes out is what's inside. In times of trial, how do we respond? Is it with prayer? Is it trusting in God's plan for your life? Or is it resorting to trying to do it yourself? So I coach baseball across the street at her high school, and we're right in the middle of the season. We beat South Lake, so it was a good week. So one thing we were talking about as coaches the other day is that, especially at the younger levels, but even in high school, when the pitcher's, the guy at the mound, he takes the ball and he comes set, when he is stressed and people are screaming, just throw strikes, that's what everybody yells, but it's a lot harder than it seems, right? You just yell at them and it doesn't help. So they just get more and more panicked. So when that happens, they resort back to what is familiar. And so what happens is they try to do too much. They try to check the base runners. They try to prevent them from stealing the base, or they try to throw the pitch too hard. And what ends up happening is they think they can control all of it, and they throw the ball too hard. It causes a defensive error. The guy takes the next base. Something like that happens, right? So when these pitchers are offline, it causes these errors, and when they try to do it all themselves, ultimately it's to their own detriment and the team's detriment. So what happens, what they resort back to, is what's familiar in those times of crisis. It's not like Pharaoh, Moses, and Aaron during this crisis in this scene are just like, hey, let's put together a committee, let's take 3 weeks, let's figure out what to do next, it's fine, it's casual, it's not a big deal. No, they revert back to what is familiar. So you might be thinking, well, these are cool ideas, but I don't know how to shift my practices when it's familiar and there's things are ingrained in me. So in sports, going back to the same story, why do we practice? So we practice to prepare ourselves to anticipate possible future outcomes of the game. In our lives, we have the opportunity to do just the same. So what do first responders do when a crisis happens? Do they create an action plan in that moment? No. They've practiced the action plan tons of times before that challenging situation has occurred. And so what could an action plan look like in our lives when things are going astray? It could look like having a devotional next to the bed, where every morning when you wake up and your feet hit the floor, you make a point of reading the inspirational message. Or it could look like praying before you go to bed at night, or in the crazy rush hour traffic that we have here when you're hopefully not screaming out the windows. Or even joining a Bible study group or a small group, which allows for spiritual support when times are tough. This can look different from every person, but my recommendation is that we're intentional about setting time apart for our relationship with God. That way, when uncertain and challenging times come, we revert to what is familiar to listen to God's guidance. I pray that these words stay with you in your time of need, that in the midst of suffering, remember it is okay to feel. In this passage, we see God in and through this time. Doesn't abandon the people in this narrative. But it's okay to feel what is happening. And whether you're just entering a storm, currently working through one, or just got through one, even when your heart is torn in 2 directions, remember that God is always with you. Amen.